The Garinagu and Chatoyer's punch ladle, a unique item for a unique culture.
This story takes place on St. Vincent, a small island in the eastern Caribbean in the Windward Islands. St. Vincent is notable for the large volcano La Soufriere in the north of the island. It is also the birthplace of a unique culture formed by influences from the Americas, Africa and Europe. The story of St. Vincent is inexorably linked with this group, the Black Caribs, more properly known as the Garifuna or the Garinagu. How did this unique culture come to exist? It begins with a shipwreck. The exact date of the wreck is unknown, with various dates given depending on who is telling the story, but there is evidence that it may have taken place as early as 1635. A ship, probably Spanish, carrying slaves from the Bight of Benin was shipwrecked nearby to St. Vincent, on the island of Bequia. These slaves managed to escape the wreck and made their way to St. Vincent, although the majority of accounts say that they were rescued by the native island Carib population of St. Vincent, the Garinagu, who were able to reach the wreck in their canoes. It appears that the Africans were initially kept as slaves by the Garinagu, but there was clearly some intermarriage between them, which resulted in Garinagu influences in the Garinagu genome that can still be seen among their descendants today. The new arrivals also adopted the island Carib language as their own, resulting in a dialect that, although still largely Carib, has heavy African influences, and also some European influences, primarily through French. They also adopted Carib practices like head binding to shape their children's skulls to create sloping foreheads. This is what we can describe as a creolized society, one which was born of a union, willing or otherwise, between two different cultures to create something new. At some point, conflict appears to have emerged between the new Garinagu and the Garinagu. The Garinagu's birth rate hugely outstripped that of the Garinagu. There is a story, in fact, that the Garinagu were threatened by this and proposed to kill all of the Garinagu menfolk, which led to an uprising that freed the Garinagu from Garinagu control. The Garinagu would later spread the story that the Garinagu frequently captured their womenfolk. Regardless, the two cultures at one point appear to have become separated from one another, with a certain amount of hostility between the two. It was the conflicts between the two cultures that led the Garinagu in the late 1710s to ask the French settlers on the nearby island of Martinique for military aid against the Garinagu, telling them the story of how the Garinagu had captured their womenfolk. There had been little European interaction with St. Vincent up until this time, with an occasional visit for wood and water. St. Vincent had been declared a neutral territory by France and England in 1660. However, this neutrality was frequently ignored over the years. A French Jesuit missionary, Adrien Le Breton, also lived on the island for a number of years at the end of the 17th century, but his attempts to convert the locals, Garinagu and Garinagu both, to Roman Catholicism bore little, if any, fruit. The French sent a force of some 300 men from Martinique to St. Vincent, but this had little effect against the Garinagu. The Garinagu, however, signed a treaty with the French, and the Garinagu would later send emissaries to Martinique to protest and reach an arrangement with the French. From this time forth, some French colonists settled on the island, although they were not large in number. The British had also laid claim to St. Vincent, with the grant originally made of St. Vincent and several other islands by Charles I to the Earl of Carlisle in the early 1600s, despite the fact that Britain was not in control of said islands. However, at no point did the English and later the British make a serious claim to the island, although a survey was led by one Captain Braithwaite in 1722 and met by much hostility by the indigenous Garinagu population. The island would continue to remain technically neutral for a number of years, until the end of the 7 Years' War and the Treaty of Paris. This removed the neutrality of the island and granted it to the British. However, it must be noted that the wording of the treaty made no mention of the island's indigenous populations, and neither Garinagu or Garinagu were involved in the negotiations. Thus St. Vincent became a British territory. In order to recoup some of the costs of the war, it was decided that the island would be surveyed and parcels of land sold, with a land commission created for that purpose. The land commissioners were, however, given strict instructions they were not to survey or sell Carib lands to the north of the island. The land commissioners were not, however, prevented from making offers to the Garinagu that, in return for their land and the right to build roads through Garinagu territory, they would receive the rights and protections of British citizens. None accepted this offer. The land commissioners were not deterred and managed to convince the British government to allow the sale of Carib lands, although the British government did say that the Caribs had to have the matter explained to them, that the matter was understood, and that the Caribs had to be reimbursed for the land. When this was relayed to Joseph Chatoyer, he famously remarked, "Quel roi," noting that he did not recognise the authority of the King of Great Britain and would only trust the French governor of Martinique.
Thus tensions continued to rise. The commissioners did nothing to bring them down and in fact exacerbated them. In late 1768 the commissioners attempted to build a road through Carib territory, something that they had not actually been explicitly authorised by the British government to do, and certainly not by either Garinagu or Kalinago. When the road reached the border of their lands, the Garinagu took the detachment of 40 soldiers that had been sent to guard the road as hostages, thus hugely ramping up tensions. Although the rest of the troops on the island, 100 in all, were mobilised, the commissioners thought that they did not have the legal authority to force the Garinagu to release the hostages. In the end, the hostages were released, but tensions remained high, and the Garinagu began to raid settlements. In light of the deteriorating situation, the commissioners begged the government in London for a military force to be sent to St. Vincent. However, this did not happen immediately, and for the next few years the situation remained tense. After a failed conference with the Garinagu in June 1771, where they reiterated that they did not recognise the British King's authority, the commissioners again recommended a show of force to cower the Garinagu into submission, and this time the British government agreed. A large military force under the command of William Dalrymple was assembled and dispatched to St. Vincent, arriving in September 1772. After one final attempt to get the Garinagu to acquiesce to British demands, which they naturally refused, the First Carib War began, lasting for 5 months. It was a difficult campaign for the British Army, as they were unused to fighting in the jungle terrain of the north of the island, and unable to counter the Garinagu's guerrilla tactics. Slowly but surely, the British were able to establish a series of military posts throughout the north of the island, but in truth this was not what really drew both parties into negotiations. The war had proved controversial in Britain, with many feeling that there was no claim to the Garinagu territories in the north of the island, and that the terms of the Treaty of Paris only granted Britain control over the French territories in the south. Speeches against the government's policy were made in Parliament, and eventually the government bowed to pressure and ordered Dalrymple to negotiate with the Garinagu. Many of the leading Garinagu chiefs were indeed willing to negotiate, presumably despite their success because they were running low on supplies. The negotiations resulted in the Garinagu giving up some of their territories, but new borders were fixed, and they were given protections against the sale of their lands against their will. In return, the Garinagu were supposed to swear an oath of loyalty to the British King, support the British against his enemies, namely the French, and return runaway slaves. The treaty, however, was unsatisfactory for both sides. The planters, the British settlers on St. Vincent, had not been involved in negotiations, and they felt that the treaty had been too generous to the Garinagu, and they had not obtained the lands that they felt they should have. Many Garinagu were angry with their leaders for not carrying on the fight, and reoccupied much of the lands that were ceded by the treaty. Here on this map of St. Vincent you can see the dividing line between the Garinagu territories in the north and what would become the British territories in the south. Much of the eastern coast of the island was reoccupied, however, by the Garinagu, who refused to accept the terms of the treaty.
Let us now focus on one of the signatories of the treaty, someone we have mentioned before, Joseph Chatoyer. Like the majority of Garinagu who lived on St. Vincent in the 18th century, he adopted a French name, but his original name appears to have been Chatoyer.
He appears to have become a leader among the Garinagu at quite a young age, and was identified from the 1760s as a leader amongst that people, and was regarded by both French and British observers as the person to deal with amongst the Garinagu. Although there is a question of how much power and influence he really wielded amongst the Garinagu in his early years, he undoubtedly became their most influential leader, being recognised late in life as paramount chief of the whole Garinagu people. For the significance of his role in Vincentian history, he is recognised by the modern nation of St. Vincent and the Grenadines as their only national hero. Uniquely among the West India Committee collection, we have the only known artefact attributed to Chatoyer. This punch ladle was donated to the committee by Mr. MacGregor Frame, a prominent member of the committee in the early 1900s. Quite how Mr. MacGregor Frame came by the artefact is unknown, but there are several unique aspects to the ladle which point to its Garinagu origins. The decoration on the bowl is unlike anything else found in the Caribbean. The inscribed silver rim, which appears to date from the late 18th century, says Chatoyer 1773 upon it, which is from where we get the artefact's reputed origin. It may very well be that it ended up in British hands around the time of the peace treaty.
The patterning on the bowl, although unique in the Caribbean, does bear a certain similarity to patterning found on the famous Benin bronzes. Given that the ancestors of the Garinagu were said to be slaves taken from the Bight of Benin, it does lend a certain credence to the artefact's origins. You can see this similarity between the kilt of the statue on the right and the bands around the bowl of the ladle on the left. It is likely that the bowl was the original part of the artefact and that the handle was added at a later date, probably when it was brought to Europe.
It was very fashionable in late 18th century and early 19th century Europe to have a punch or toddy ladle made out of a Caribbean coconut. This was in part due to a belief that any drink served out of a coconut could not be poisoned. The patterns on such coconut ladles were usually carved in Europe, and the designs found upon them reflect that. The unusual patterning on this ladle again points to a non-European origin. Then, as now, it was common for the parties to present one another with gifts at the signing of a treaty. It may very well have been gifted to William Dalrymple, or another member of the British negotiating party, at the end of the First Carib War. Although we cannot say for certain that the artefact was ever Chatoyer's, there is significant evidence that it is Garinagu in origin, and it remains the only artefact associated with the man.
Although an uneasy peace reigned for a time, with the Garinagu freely travelling to Kingstown, the capital of St. Vincent, to trade their produce at market, war would once again rear its head. The French allied themselves with the revolutionaries in the American War of Independence and declared war on Britain. The Garinagu, still closely allied with the French despite their treaty with the British, sided with the former when they attacked St. Vincent. This took the British completely by surprise, and the military commander of the island, George Etherington, decided to surrender without mounting serious resistance, despite the wishes of the governor, Valentine Morris. Eventually, the island was returned to the British by the treaties of Versailles, signed by France and Britain at the end of the war. According to some accounts, the Garinagu were very surprised to see the British return. Despite the violation of the treaty they had signed with the Garinagu, the British made no reprisals against the inhabitants of St. Vincent.
For the next decade, matters became quite peaceful. Garinagu traders once again plied their wares in Kingstown, and some even purchased property within the British areas of the island. Some Garinagu chiefs, namely Chatoyer and his brother-in-law Duvaye, established their own cotton plantations, which were worked by slave labour. These chiefs were also the guests of leading planters on the island, such as Sir William Young. Sir William went so far as to gift a silver-mounted sword that had once belonged to his brother to Chatoyer. Yet under this seeming peace, tensions remained, with issues of trespass by the Garinagu onto some British lands, and some planters still seeking to acquire the fertile Garinagu lands around the volcano in the north of the island. Matters would once again change with the French Revolution. After the overthrow of the French monarchy, the French revolutionary government declared war on Britain, and revolutionary zeal and ideals quickly spread to the French Caribbean, and French agents, most notably Governor Victor Hughes, attempted to spread these ideas to the British West Indies.
The notions of liberté, égalité and fraternité found purchase among the lower classes of the skin colour-based hierarchy of the Caribbean, and uprisings occurred on several islands. Victor Hughes also made overtures to the Garinagu, reminding them of their previous alliance with France and sending gifts. These arguments were successful, and the Garinagu allied themselves once more with the French and declared war on the British, an act that took the British completely by surprise. Those planters who had welcomed the Garinagu chiefs into their homes were particularly shocked. Sir William Young, who had gifted his brother's sword to Chatoyer, seems to have taken it personally. Joseph Chatoyer, by now paramount chief of the entire Garinagu people, issued this declaration, seen here, which is very much couched in the language of the French revolutionaries. Where is the Frenchman who will not join his brothers at a moment when the voice of liberty is heard by them? Let us then unite, citizens and brothers, round the colours flying in this island, and let us hasten to cooperate to that great piece of work which has already been commenced so gloriously. But should any timorous men still exist, should any Frenchman be held back through fear, we do hereby declare to them, in the name of the law, that those who will not be assembled with us in the course of the day shall be deemed traitors to the country, and treated as enemies. We do swear that both fire and sword shall be employed against them, that we are going to burn their estates, and that we will murder their wives and children in order to annihilate their race. The Franco-Garinagu force was initially very successful, driving south towards Kingstown and taking up a position on Dorsetshire Hill. However, the St. Vincent militia launched a night attack, in which Chatoyer was killed. This is attributed to Major Alexander Leith, a younger son of a Scottish family who had emigrated to make his fortune in the Caribbean. Despite the loss of Chatoyer and being initially pushed back from Kingstown, the Garinagu and French continued the fight. However, a wave of British reinforcements from the expedition brought to the Caribbean by Sir Ralph Abercrombie as part of the larger war decisively turned the conflict in favour of Britain, and the French forces surrendered. Although many Garinagu continued to fight on, hiding in the interior of their territory, some Garinagu chiefs came forward to ask for peace and hoped to negotiate to retain control over their territory. However, the British response, feeling that, in light of events, long-term peaceful coexistence was impossible, this time resolved to do what many amongst the planters had been asking for since the 1760s, exile the Garinagu from the island. Thus over 4,000 Garinagu, including a son and daughter of Chatoyer and his brother Lord Duvaye, were exiled to Balasso, an island just 33 kilometres from Kingstown. They would remain here for several months, but not before half of their number succumbed to disease, namely a form of fever. The survivors were transported to the island of Roatan, off the coast of Honduras, where they were left with several months' supplies and expected to form a new colony. However, they were invited to the mainland by the Spanish colony at Trujillo, which had suffered its own issues and needed to recover its own population numbers. The Garinagu did so, and quickly came to thrive at Trujillo and its surroundings. Over time, new Garinagu communities were established in Central America, most notably in British Guiana, now Belize. Over the years, in no small part due to many of their number becoming sailors, the Garinagu community spread to the USA, with communities to be found in many different cities, including in Houston, Texas, New Orleans in Louisiana, and especially New York City.
Back on St. Vincent, shortly after the exile of the Garinagu, the Kalinago, of whom a few remained, asked and received permission from the British governor to settle near Sandy Bay on the northeast coast of the island. The numbers of the Kalinago had been steadily decreasing over the course of the 18th century. Many of their number had departed the island forever in the 1750s to go and dwell in Trinidad, as a result of their continuing poor relations with the Garinagu. Not all Garinagu had been exiled either. Many had successfully hid in the interior of the island, making use of the jungle terrain. In 1805, these were granted a pardon, and many again opted to settle near Sandy Bay. The 1812 eruption of the volcano and the devastation that it wrought led many among the Carib communities to emigrate to Trinidad. They were also sorely tested by the eruption of 1902, which resulted in the deaths of almost 2,000 people. Indeed, in the immediate aftermath of the 1902 eruption, the devastation in the north of the island was such that it was thought that the entirety of the Carib community had been totally wiped out, although it was soon discovered that there were indeed survivors. The descendants of the Kalinagu and Garinagu continue to live in the area surrounding Sandy Bay today. Today, with communities thriving around the globe, it is believed there are somewhere in the region of 300,000 Garinagu in the world. Their unique language, music and dance, that has survived the 200 years since their exile from the island of St. Vincent, has been inscribed by UNESCO as part of humanity's intangible heritage and culture. The last surviving physical relic of their time on St. Vincent, the Ladle attributed to Joseph Chatoyer, has been scanned and is available to view as a 3D model through the West India Committee Heritage Portal. For more information about this topic, as well as the history and heritage of the Caribbean and the work of the West India Committee, please visit us at westindiacommittee.org. Thank you.